The Grand Conclave Chamber was the most powerful room in the known galaxy, and everyone inside it knew that very well. It floated in the neutral zone between 17 civilizations, a massive ring-shaped station that had existed for over 3,000 years. Every wall was carved from black starstone. Every seat at the great circular table was worth more than most planets, and every being who sat in those seats had spent decades earning the right to be there. Tonight, the chamber was quiet in a way that felt wrong. Ambassador Vale of the Crethan Dominion stood at the center podium. He was tall, gray-skinned, with 4 narrow eyes that caught the light like polished glass. He had served the council for 60 years. He had seen wars end at this table. He had seen species collapse and species rise. He believed deeply and completely that the council existed to keep the galaxy in order. That was why he had called this session. That was why he had spent the last 3 years preparing for this exact moment. He looked around the room at the 16 other ambassadors, and he began to speak. "The data is not in question," he said, his voice calm and measured, the kind of voice that had been trained over decades to sound reasonable even when saying unreasonable things. "The human species has been a member of this council for 40 years. In that time, they have colonized 30 worlds. They have developed 3 independent forms of faster-than-light travel. They have brokered peace between the Sorathi and the Ven, 2 species that had been at war for 900 years. They have done all of this without asking our permission, without slowing down, and without showing any sign that they intend to stop." He paused and let that sit in the air. "Every projection model we have run across every civilization represented in this room points to the same outcome. If humanity is allowed to continue at their current rate of growth, they will be the dominant force in this galaxy within 5 centuries. Not a force. The dominant force, one species controlling the shape of everything." The chamber stayed quiet. That was how Vale knew he had them. Ambassador Seath of the Voakai Collective leaned forward. She was small, blue, and ancient in a way that made her look like something carved from ice. "You are proposing a preemptive action," she said. "I am proposing a containment measure," Vale said. "There is a difference." There was a long silence. Then the arguments began. They lasted for 4 hours. Some ambassadors pushed back hard. The representative from the Thule Federation, a young species themselves by galactic standards, argued that what Vale was describing was simply fear disguised as strategy. The Haven Collective's ambassador said that striking a council member without provocation would set a precedent that could never be undone. Several others said nothing at all, which in council politics meant they were already decided and just waiting to see which way the room went. Vale answered every objection with data, charts, projections, historical parallels. He had prepared for every argument because he had run every argument through his own staff for 2 years before stepping into this room. He was not a man who left things to chance. And in the end, when the vote was called, the count came back 9-8 in favor. The Meridian Decree was passed. It was classified at the highest possible level. No record of it would leave this station. No human diplomat, no human intelligence network, no human anything would ever know this vote had happened. The Council's combined military arm would organize a strike force. The target would be Oros Prime, humanity's most populated colony world outside the Sol system. The goal was not total destruction. The goal was a message, delivered in the only language Vale believed humanity would understand quickly enough. Force. Overwhelming, undeniable, unmistakable force. Hit them hard enough that they stopped growing. Hit them hard enough that they looked inward instead of outward. Buy the galaxy another few centuries of balance. That was the plan. Vale's aide, a young Crethan named Sorvin who had worked with him for 6 years, walked beside him as they left the chamber through the private exit corridor. Sorvin had been in the observation booth during the vote. He had heard everything. He was quiet for a long time as they walked, which was unusual for him because Sorvin was almost never quiet. Finally he spoke. "Ambassador," he said, I have to ask something. Then ask, Vale said. Have any of the projections accounted for how humans respond to being attacked? Vale did not slow his walk. They will respond the way any young species responds to superior force. They will panic. Their governments will argue. Their people will fracture. They are not unified enough to mount a coordinated military response against the combined strength of the Council. Sorvin was quiet for another moment. Then he said, I have spent the last 3 years studying human history as part of my background research for your files. Every war they have ever fought, every crisis, every moment where outside pressure was applied to their civilization from a direction they did not expect. He paused. Ambassador, I do not think they will panic. Vale stopped walking. He turned and looked at his aide. What do you think they will do? Sorvin met his eyes, which was rare for a junior aide addressing a senior ambassador. I think they will stop arguing with each other, he said quietly. Vale looked at him for a long moment. Then he turned and kept walking. You worry too much, he said. They are 40 years old in the stars. We have been here for 3,000. Send the order to the fleet. Sorvin sent the order. 400 Crethan warships, the finest in the Dominion's arsenal, were already positioned at the edge of human space. They had been moved there quietly over the past 8 months under the cover of a routine patrol expansion. No human sensor grid had flagged the movement, or at least no human sensor grid had reported flagging it. The fleet commander, Admiral Duvas, received the authorization code at 300 station time. He verified it 3 times because he was the kind of commander who verified things 3 times. Then he gave the order. The fleet dropped into faster-than-light travel. On Oros Prime, it was morning. The colony was 20 years old and had grown faster than anyone had predicted, which was true of most things humans built. The cities were spread across 4 continents. Farms stretched from coast to coast. The sky was a light, clean blue that the original settlers had fallen in love with immediately and had never stopped talking about. Children were going to school. Workers were heading to shipyards and research stations and crop fields. Everything was ordinary in the way that life becomes ordinary when it has been safe for long enough. Then the Crethan fleet came out of FTL above the planet's northern hemisphere and opened fire. The orbital defense platforms were destroyed in the first 90 seconds. 3 of the colony's major power relay stations were hit in the next 3 minutes. The capital city's government center was struck at the 6-minute mark. Emergency broadcasts went out across every channel, but the communication satellites were being targeted as well, and the signals were already breaking up. 2.3 million people were in the direct impact zones in those first 6 hours. The feeds reached Earth 17 minutes after the first strike. Automated relay systems picked them up and pushed them to every screen on every human world in the network before any government official had time to decide whether the footage should be released or contained. It did not matter anyway. Humans had spent decades building redundant communication networks specifically because they did not trust single points of failure. The footage was everywhere before anyone could stop it. In the Grand Conclave Chamber, now empty and dark, the voting record of the Meridian Decree sat in an encrypted file that only 9 beings in the galaxy could access. Vale was in his private quarters watching the Oros Prime feeds on a secure monitor. He watched the fires and the broken skyline, and he felt, if not satisfaction, then at least the cold certainty of a man who believed he had done what needed to be done. His monitor showed a secondary feed, human news networks, live, unfiltered. They were not panicking. He watched the anchors. He watched the government officials who were already appearing on screens. He watched the ordinary people in the streets of cities on Earth and Mars and a dozen other worlds, standing still, looking up at screens in public squares, watching the same footage he was watching. Their faces were not afraid. Their faces were something else entirely, something Vale did not have a word for in his own language. Something that lived in the space between grief and a decision that has already been made. He kept watching, and for the first time since he had called the council session 3 years ago, Ambassador Vale felt something he had not planned for. He felt uncertain. The first thing the president of the Terran Union did when the Oros Prime footage reached her desk was close her office door and stand very still for exactly 4 minutes. Her senior staff waited outside in the corridor, not speaking, not moving, just waiting. They had all seen the feeds. They all knew what was coming. They were waiting to find out what shape it would take. When she opened the door, her face was calm. Her eyes were not. "Get me every head of state on a live line," she said. "Every colony governor, every fleet admiral, every defense minister. I want them all in the same call within the next 2 hours. And someone find out where that fleet came from because I want that answer before the call starts." Her staff moved. That was the thing about the Terran Union's leadership apparatus. It had been built across generations to move fast when it needed to, because humans had learned a long time ago that slow governments got their people killed. Within 40 minutes, the intelligence answer came back. The hull markings on the attacking ships were Crethan. The fleet's point of origin, based on trajectory analysis, was consistent with a staging area in the Dominion's outer patrol zone that had quietly grown from a standard 6-ship rotation to over 400 warships across the past 8 months. The intelligence chief who delivered the report placed it on the president's desk and then said, very carefully, "There is one more thing." He slid a second file across. "Our long-range passive monitoring picked up a tight beam communication from the Conclave station to the Crethan Fleet Command approximately 19 hours before the attack. We could not decrypt the content, but we can confirm the origin point." The president looked at the file, then she looked at him. "The council authorized this," she said. "It was not a question." He said nothing. He didn't need to. When the joint call began, it included 47 heads of state, 19 colonial governors, and 12 fleet admirals spread across every human world in the network. The connection had latency issues because some of the outer colonies were far enough out that real-time communication required relay chains, but they made it work because they had built the relay chains for exactly this kind of moment. The call lasted 3 hours and 40 minutes. For the first hour, people argued. That was expected and even necessary because humans did not trust unified decisions that happened without argument. The arguments covered the full range. Was the intelligence on the council's involvement solid enough? What were the legal frameworks under the Compact Treaty? What was the proportionate response? Who had the authority to authorize a military action of the scale being discussed? And a dozen other questions that all needed to be heard out loud before they could be set aside. But something was different about this argument, and everyone on the call felt it even if no one said it directly. There was no faction pushing for inaction. There was no bloc trying to use the crisis for internal political leverage. There was no subgroup trying to quietly position itself to benefit from whatever came next. The attack on Oros Prime had killed 2.3 million people who had done nothing except live in a colony that another civilization decided was a useful target. And every human on that call, regardless of what world they came from or what political position they held, shared one thing in their gut that was louder than any argument. This was not a dispute to be managed. This was an answer to be given. By the second hour, the arguments had narrowed. By the third hour, a framework existed. In the final 40 minutes, the Unified Emergency Mandate was drafted, reviewed, and signed by every participant on the call. It was the first document in human history to carry the simultaneous authorization of every governing body in human space. It suspended all inter-colony political disputes for the duration of the crisis. It centralized military command under a single structure. It authorized whatever resource allocation was required, and it named Admiral Seraph Voss as the commander of the newly designated Terran Expeditionary Force. The choice of Voss was not controversial. She had spent 30 years in human fleet operations, the last 12 as commander of the Outer Rim Defense Network. She was known for two things: She did not lose, and she did not waste. Every campaign she had ever run had been completed faster and with fewer casualties than anyone projected on both sides. When junior officers asked her what the key to that record was, she always gave the same answer: know exactly what you are trying to achieve before you move a single ship. She received the appointment notification while she was already on a transport heading toward the Outer Rim Command Station. She had seen the RO's prime feeds like everyone else. She had not waited to be called. She had already started moving. When she arrived at the command station and walked into the primary operations center, the staff who had been working the room for the past 12 hours stood automatically, not because protocol required it, because of who she was and what her presence meant. It meant the thinking phase was over. She stood in front of the main strategic display, which showed every ship in the human fleet at its current position. She looked at it for a long time. Then she turned to her chief of intelligence. "Show me the real charts," she said. He knew exactly what she meant. He pulled up a second overlay, not the official star charts that the Council had provided to humanity during the treaty process 40 years ago, the ones with certain systems conveniently left vague or incorrectly mapped, but the charts that human survey ships had been quietly building for the past 20 years through a combination of independent deep space probes, commercial shipping data, and some very careful intelligence work that had never been officially sanctioned, but had also never been officially stopped. The real charts were significantly more detailed than the official ones. They showed the actual locations of Council fleet stations, supply depots, communication relay hubs, and military infrastructure across 17 systems. They showed patrol routes. They showed response times. They showed gaps. Voss studied them without speaking for almost 10 minutes. No one in the room spoke either. Then she picked up a marker and began to draw lines on the display. "We are not defending," she said, and her voice was the same quiet tone she always used, the one that somehow carried to every corner of every room she ever stood in. "Defending tells them that hitting us is a strategy that works. We are not going to teach them that." She drew another line. "We are going to answer." She turned to face the room. "Get me the shipyard output numbers, all of them, official capacity, actual capacity, and surge capacity." The numbers came back within minutes. The official capacity of human shipyards across all worlds was substantial. The actual current output was running at around 30% of that because peacetime economics did not require full production. The surge capacity, what the yards could produce if every civilian contract was suspended, every reserve workforce activated, every material allocation redirected, was a number that made two of the junior staff members in the room go very quiet when they saw it. Voss looked at the surge number and nodded once. "Activate all yards to full surge immediately," she said. "I also want the archive files on the Vega-class heavy carrier and the longbow destroyer line." Her chief of staff hesitated. "Those designs were shelved," he said carefully. "The Council diplomatic team flagged them during the treaty review as being inconsistent with the spirit of the mutual defense framework." Voss looked at him. "The Council just killed 2.3 million of our people," she said. "Pull the files." The files were pulled. The designs were approved within the hour. Shipyards that had been operating at quiet peacetime rhythms began to change their sound. The shift was physical. You could feel it in the station decks, in the vibration of fabrication bays cycling up to speeds they had not run at in years. Materials that had been sitting in reserve storage began to move. Workers who had been on standard rotations began receiving recall notices. Across every human world, the same change was happening, not in a panicked way, not in a chaotic way, in the focused, organized, deeply purposeful way that humans moved when they had decided on something completely. On the Conclave station, Council Intelligence Director S. Savith was watching the human feeds with his full staff. They had been monitoring since the Oro's prime strike, looking for the panic response, the political fracturing, the internal blame cycles that should have been fragmenting human attention by now. Instead, his analysts kept bringing him the same reports: unified government action, shipyard activation, fleet repositioning, the unified emergency mandate signed by everyone. Savith was 400 years old. He had watched civilizations do many things under pressure. He had never seen anything quite like this. "Where is their fleet moving?" he asked. "That is the issue," his lead analyst said. "We are tracking approximately 400 of their ships on standard patrol and defensive repositioning, but we are calculating that their total active fleet should be significantly larger than that based on known registry numbers." She paused. "Director, we cannot find approximately 1,200 of their warships." The room was very quiet. Savith looked at the display for a long time. 1,200 ships did not simply disappear. They went somewhere. The question was where, and the worst question was why he could not see them. He thought about what that meant for a long moment. Then he said, in a voice that was barely above a whisper, "We just signed our own doom." Nobody in the room contradicted him. Across human space, Admiral Seraph Voss stood in front of her completed deployment map and looked at 17 marked positions in Council space that no Council intelligence officer knew she had data on. She had spent 12 years building this information. She had never been sure she would need it. She was sure now. "Execute Phase 1, she said, and the Terran Expeditionary Force moved. Grand Admiral Duvas had commanded the Crethan fleet for 22 years and he had never lost a battle. That was not arrogance on his part, it was simply the record. He had fought 7 engagements against 3 different species, and in every case the outcome had followed the same pattern: superior numbers, superior firepower, controlled application of force. His fleet was the finest the Dominion had ever assembled, and he knew it the way a craftsman knows a good tool, with quiet confidence and zero doubt. He did not feel quiet confidence right now. He was standing on the command bridge of his flagship, the KDS Eternal Reach, watching his tactical displays with an expression his crew had never seen on his face before. They didn't have a name for it. It was somewhere between confusion and the beginning of understanding something you very much did not want to understand. The Council's combined response fleet, assembled after the Oros Prime strike to intercept any human military movement at the border, had been in position for 6 days. 3,000 ships from 9 member species, positioned at every logical entry point into Council space from human territory. The defensive grid was, by any reasonable strategic calculation, impenetrable. You could not move a fleet of any meaningful size through that border without being detected, intercepted, and stopped. The humans had not come through the border. The first report had come from the Voakai relay station in the Aldine system, 40 light-years inside Council space. The station had gone dark without warning, without a distress signal, without any indication of trouble before the moment it stopped transmitting. The second report, or rather, the absence of a report, came from the fuel depot at Kersh Point, which missed its standard check-in, and then missed the follow-up check-in as well. Then the communication hub at Tesvar went dark. Then the military supply station at Grid 9. All of them inside Council space. All of them hit cleanly and quietly. All of them done before anyone on the Council's border fleet had any idea something was wrong. Duvas had requested a full strategic assessment, and the answer that came back from his intelligence staff was delivered by a young analyst named Veth who looked like she hadn't slept in 2 days, because she hadn't. She placed her report on his desk, and then explained it out loud because she could tell from his face that he needed to hear it as well as read it. "They were already inside our space before we finished assembling the border fleet," she said. "Based on the timing of the first station loss and the last confirmed position data we have for their vessels, we believe they repositioned covert supply and support ships inside our territory over a period of several months, disguised as civilian transports. When their main fleet moved, it did not come through the border. It came through us." She paused. "Sir, They have been inside our space for at least 8 months. Duvas looked at the report. How many of their ships? We do not have a firm count. Based on the speed and scale of what they have hit so far, we estimate the force operating inside our space is somewhere between 800 and 1,200 warships. The number sat in the air between them. And the border fleet is positioned to stop them coming in, Duvas said, mostly to himself. Yes, sir, Veth said. They are facing the wrong direction. He ordered the border fleet to reposition immediately. But repositioning 3,000 ships was not a fast process, and by the time the reorientation was underway, the Terran Expeditionary Force had already hit 11 more targets. Not destroyed them, hit them. That was the word Duvas kept coming back to as the damage reports arrived, because destroyed would have been more familiar. He knew how to process destroyed. What the humans were doing was something more precise, and in its own way, more unsettling. The fleet fuel depot at Kersh Point had been disabled, not blown apart. The power generation systems were gone, the docking infrastructure was heavily damaged, but the main structure was intact and the emergency life support was still running. The crew had survived, every one of them. The relay station at Aldine had been taken offline by what the engineering report described as a targeted strike on the signal amplification arrays. The station could not communicate, but it was not a wreck. The crew had received a broadcast on a local frequency from the attacking ships 14 minutes before the strike telling them to move to the protected interior sections. All of them had. Every target the humans hit was hit the same way. Disable, not destroy. Take the military or strategic value off the board without turning it into a graveyard. And always, there was the warning broadcast first, giving the crews enough time to get clear of the most dangerous sections. Duvas called his tactical staff together and showed them the pattern. They looked at it in silence for a while. Then his senior tactical officer, a veteran named Commander Rail who had been in fleet operations for 30 years, said, "They are not trying to punish us." "No," Duvas said. "They are trying to win," Rail said, and there was something strange in his voice. A kind of reluctant respect that a warrior could not fully suppress when he saw another warrior doing something brilliantly. They have decided what winning looks like, and they are moving toward it in a straight line. They are not being distracted by the chance to cause more damage than is necessary. Duvas nodded. "And that," he said quietly, "is what makes them more dangerous than anything we prepared for." The actual engagement, when the two fleets finally found each other in the Tesvar corridor, lasted 11 days. Duvas had approximately 600 ships in the sector by the time he managed to get them repositioned. The Terran force he was facing numbered, his analysts believed, around 900. The battles were spread across 4 separate engagement zones, and none of them followed any tactical pattern the Krethan fleet had trained against. The humans did not mass their firepower the way standard doctrine said you were supposed to. They split their forces into smaller, faster groups that moved in coordinated patterns, hitting different sections of his formation simultaneously, pulling his ships out of their defensive configurations, creating gaps, and then using those gaps before they could close. When Duvas tried to concentrate his forces to match one of the human strike groups, 2 others would appear on a different vector. When he tried to hold a position, the human groups would simply move around it and keep hitting things behind him. His ships were not being destroyed in large numbers. That was the other thing. The engagement was not a slaughter. It was a systematic, methodical, deeply professional dismantling. His fleet's capacity to operate as a unit was being taken apart piece by piece. Drive systems, weapons arrays. Communication links between ships. The humans targeted the things that made a fleet rather than just a collection of individual ships. And they were good at it in a way that told Duvas these were not tactics being improvised in the field. These were tactics that had been planned and trained for a long time. On the 5th day of the engagement, he received a short-range communication from the Terran fleet flagship. It was not a demand for surrender. It was not a threat. It was a single sentence from the Terran fleet commander. "Admiral Duvas, you are fighting well, but you cannot win this engagement. I would rather stop adding to either side's casualty list. Open a command channel when you are ready to talk." He did not open the channel. He kept fighting for 6 more days because he was Crethan, and stopping was not something that came naturally to his people. On the 11th day, with less than 40% of his fleet still combat-capable, and his own flagship running on backup power after losing 2 engine arrays, he opened the channel. The voice on the other end was calm, unhurried, and not unkind. "Thank you, Admiral," she said. They spoke for 20 minutes. The terms were not what he expected. There were no terms, in the traditional sense of a defeated commander being told what he owed the victor. Admiral Voss told him that his surviving ships would be given whatever repair support the Terran engineering teams could provide. His crews would be given food, medical attention, and safe passage back to Crethan space. His wounded would be treated by human medical staff before his own people could reach them. And when they were ready to leave, he and every surviving member of his fleet would be given a single data chip. "What is on the chip?" he asked. "A message," she said, "for the Council." He was quiet for a moment. "And what do you want in return for this?" There was a brief pause on the line. "I want you to go home," she said, "and I want you to tell every person you pass on the way what happened here and how it ended, and what we chose not to do when we had the chance." Another pause. "And I want the Council to understand that what they have seen so far is not our full response. Tell them that specifically." Duvas sat in the dim light of his damaged bridge for a long time after the call ended. His first officer was watching him from across the room. "She let us go," the first officer said. "Yes," Duvas said. "Why?" Duvas thought about the 11 days of fighting he had just been through. He thought about the warnings before every strike. He thought about the way the engagement had been conducted, with total competence and no cruelty. He thought about what it meant that a species capable of this had chosen to fight it this way. "Because they are not trying to punish us," he said, the same words his tactical officer had used at the beginning of all this, but meaning something much larger now. "They decided what winning looks like, and this is part of it." He stood up slowly and took the data chip from the courier who brought it aboard. He turned it over in his hand. It was a small thing to carry something as heavy as what was on it. He tucked it into his uniform pocket and began the long process of bringing his broken fleet home. The Grand Conclave Chamber had held emergency sessions before, but none of them had looked quite like this. The great circular table was still there, still carved from black starstone, still worth more than most planets. The seats of 17 civilizations were still arranged in their ancient order, but the windows that ran along the outer wall of the chamber, the long curved panels of transparent alloy that showed open space, now showed something different from the usual view of distant stars. They showed Terran warships. 40 of them, positioned in a loose arc around the conclave station, close enough that you could make out the hull markings with standard optical equipment. They were not powering weapons. They were not broadcasting threats. They were simply there, visible and unmistakable, the way a very large and very calm person standing in a doorway is visible and unmistakable. Ambassador Vale looked at them from his seat and then looked away, because looking at them too long did something to his composure that he did not want the rest of the chamber to see. The emergency session had been called after Duvas's fleet returned to Crethan space, and the debriefing reports began circulating through Council intelligence channels. The reports were comprehensive, and Duvas was, to his credit, completely honest in them. He did not minimize what had happened or try to reframe it in terms that were easier to deliver. He described the engagement exactly as it had been, a systematic, professional defeat by a force that had been better prepared, better informed, and operating from a strategic position that the Council had not known existed. He described the tactics. He described the warnings before strikes. He described how his crews had been treated afterward. He also delivered the message from the data chip in full, which was the part that had triggered the emergency session. The chip contained two things. The first was a summary of what the Terran Expeditionary Force had done and could continue to do, written in plain language without exaggeration, which made it more frightening than exaggeration would have. It listed the infrastructure that had been disabled, the systems that were now under Terran operational influence, and the current positions of human fleet elements within Council space. It was specific and it was verifiable, and every intelligence team in every Council member state had spent 3 days verifying it and coming back with the same answer. All of it was accurate. The second thing on the chip was a single line: send someone to talk, send someone young. The Council had argued about that line for almost as long as they had argued about the strategic summary. What did it mean, send someone young? Was it an insult? Was it a condition? Was it a signal of some kind? Eventually, the interpretation that most of them settled on was the simplest one, which was that the humans did not want to talk to the people who had voted for the Meridian Decree. They wanted someone who had not been in that room. The decision of who to send fell, after considerable argument, to the Council Secretariat, which selected Commander Danny Acaffer of the Terran Diplomatic Liaison Office. But then everyone realized that the instruction was directed at the Council, not at humanity, and that the humans had already decided who they were sending, and it was the Council that needed to send someone young in response. The confusion lasted another half-day before it was resolved, and in the end the Council sent a junior ambassador from the Thule Federation named Restia, who was the youngest serving ambassador in the Council's current membership, and who had, notably, voted against the Meridian Decree. Restia arrived at the Conclave Station at the same time as the Terran representative. Commander Danny Acaffer was 31 years old, which made her look extremely young to species who measured their careers in centuries. She was not particularly tall. She wore a standard Terran diplomatic uniform with no decorations except the rank insignia and one small pin on her lapel that Restia later learned was a flag from Oros Prime. She carried a single case and had no entourage. She shook Restia's hand at the docking port and said, "Good to meet you. Shall we get started?" They walked into the chamber together. The 17 ambassadors who were present watched Acaffer move to the human seat at the table, the seat that human diplomats had occupied for 40 years as guests, as juniors, as the newest and youngest voice in a room full of ancient authority. She set her case on the table and opened it and removed 2 documents and placed them side by side in front of her. Then she looked around the room with the unhurried attention of someone who has absolutely nothing to prove and knows it. Vale was watching her from his seat. He had read everything the Council's intelligence services had assembled on Acaffer in the past 3 days. She was career diplomatic corps, no significant field experience, no military background. She had been assigned to the Outer Liaison Office 18 months ago. There was nothing in her file that explained why Admiral Voss had sent her specifically. But sitting across from her now, watching the way she held the room without doing anything to hold it, Vale thought he was beginning to understand. She had been sent because she was exactly what she looked like: young, steady, and completely unimpressed. "Thank you for agreeing to meet," Acaffer said. Her voice was clear and level and carried to every part of the chamber without her raising it. "I want to be straightforward about why I'm here. Because I think we've all had enough of things being handled indirectly." No one spoke. The room stayed with her. "The Meridian Decree was a decision made in this chamber by people who are in this room," she said. "You authorized a military strike on a civilian world without warning, without declaration, without any attempt at communication first. 2.3 million people died in the first 6 hours. You know the number. I'm saying it out loud because I want it to be in the record of this session rather than in a classified file that 9 people can access." Still no one spoke. 1 or 2 of the ambassadors looked at the table. Vale kept his eyes on her. "Admiral Voss sent me here to deliver 2 things," Acaffer said, and she slid the first document toward the center of the table. This is the Bill of Reclassification. The Terran Union is formally removing itself from the Council's species classification system, effective immediately. We are withdrawing from the treaty framework that designated this body as the governing authority for interspecies relations in this region of space. She let that sit for a moment. This is not a negotiating position. This is a notification. The room broke. Not violently, but decisively, voices came from multiple directions at once, some outraged, some alarmed, some asking procedural questions that were really just expressions of panic in a formal format. Restia, sitting in the Thule seat, stayed quiet and watched Akafar. Akafar waited. She did not appear uncomfortable. She appeared to be waiting in the same way a person waits for rain to pass, with no expectation that the rain cares about their schedule and no particular distress about it. When the voices died down enough, she continued as though there had been no interruption. "The second document," she said, and slid the other page forward, "is an invitation." She looked around the table. The Terran Compact is a new framework for interspecies cooperation. It is built on 3 principles: complete transparency in governance decisions that affect other species, mutual non-aggression with enforcement mechanisms that apply equally to all members, and full sovereignty for every member without classification hierarchies. She paused. Any species that wishes to engage with human space, for trade, for travel, for diplomatic communication, will do so under this framework and these terms. "You are dismantling 3,000 years of galactic order," said the ambassador from the Haven Collective, and his voice held genuine distress. "No," Akafar said, and for the first time there was something in her voice that was not quite neutral, not anger, but a precision that was sharper than the surrounding calm. "The Meridian Decree dismantled it. We are building something to replace it." She looked directly at him. "You can be part of that or you cannot be part of it, but the order you are describing is the one that authorized the killing of 2.3 million civilians to protect itself. We are not going to rebuild that." There was a long silence. Then the Thule ambassador, Restia, reached across the table and picked up the invitation document and read it carefully. The room watched him do it. When he finished, he looked up at Akafar and said simply, "Where do I sign?" 3 other ambassadors reached for the document almost immediately after that. Vale did not reach for it. He sat with his hands flat on the table and watched as the room slowly, irrevocably, began to change shape around him. He thought about the projection models that had started all of this. The ones that showed humanity becoming the dominant force in the galaxy within 5 centuries. He had looked at those models and seen a threat. He had looked at them and made a decision. He wondered, sitting in the ruin of that decision, whether he had ever thought to ask what humanity intended to do with that dominance, whether it had occurred to him that the answer might be different from what he assumed. He thought it had not. Akafar was preparing to leave. She closed her case with a quiet, final sound. She stood, straightened her uniform, and picked up her case. She looked around the room one more time with that same unhurried attention. "We tried to end us," she said, not dramatically, not as a parting shot, but simply as a statement of fact, the way you might state the weather. "We chose not to end you." She nodded once to Restia and once to the room generally. "The invitation is open. There is no deadline. We are not going anywhere." She walked out of the chamber. In the corridor outside, her aide was waiting. He fell into step beside her and they walked toward the docking port without speaking for a while. "How did it go?" he finally asked. 4 signed, she said. "Maybe 2 more by tomorrow based on their body language." "And the Crethan ambassador?" Akafar was quiet for a few steps. "He's thinking," she said. "That's more than he was doing before we came." Behind her in the chamber, Vale's aide Sorvin had quietly moved to the table and picked up the invitation document. He looked at his ambassador's back for a moment. Then he placed the document directly in front of Vale where he could not avoid seeing it. Vale looked at it for a long time without touching it. On the other side of the station's hull, framed in the long observation windows, the Terran warships held their positions in the quiet dark, patient and unhurried, and very, very present. The detention facility on Crethan Prime was not a cruel place, but it was not a comfortable one either. It was built for function rather than dignity, a low stone building at the edge of the capital city, surrounded by a security perimeter that was more symbolic than practical, because the person inside it had nowhere to go, and both of them knew it. Ambassador Vale had been confined there for 3 months, since the political tribunal had begun its slow, formal process of deciding what to do with the man who had cast the deciding vote for the Meridian Decree. He spent most of his days reading. There was not much else to do. The tribunal proceedings arrived in summary form each morning, and he read them carefully and then set them aside, because there was very little in them that surprised him anymore. He had made a decision. He had been wrong in ways that had killed millions of people and destabilized the most significant governing framework in the galaxy's modern history. The tribunal was going to reach a conclusion about that eventually, and whatever it was, he would accept it, because it was the only honest thing left available to him. On a morning in the 4th month, his guard told him he had a visitor. He expected Sorvin, who came every 2 weeks with updates on the compact negotiations and news from the wider galaxy. He did not expect the person who walked through the door. Admiral Seraph Voss looked exactly as she looked in every image he had ever seen of her, which was to say she looked like someone who had never wasted a single moment of her life and did not intend to start. She was in civilian clothes, not a uniform. No aide, no security detail. She carried nothing. She sat down across the small table from him as though they had met here many times before, and this was simply the next meeting in a long series. Vale stared at her. "Ambassador," she said. "Admiral," he said, and then, because he did not know what else to say, "This is unexpected." "I imagined so," she said. She looked around the room briefly, taking it in with the efficient attention of someone cataloging information they might need later, and then she looked back at him. "I wanted to speak with you directly. I was not sure the tribunal process would provide that opportunity, and I thought it was worth having the conversation before it closes." He folded his hands on the table. "You have come a considerable distance for a conversation," he said. "Some conversations are worth the distance," she said. There was a quiet between them that was not entirely uncomfortable. Voss seemed in no hurry to fill it, and Vale found, unexpectedly, that he was not either. He looked at her across the table and tried to see, in the person sitting there, the commander who had taken apart the finest fleet his civilization had ever assembled in 11 days. He could not quite make the two things align. She looked like someone's senior academic advisor. "Why did you come?" he asked. "I wanted to ask you something," she said. "One question." "Then ask it." She looked at him steadily. "Why?" The word was plain and direct, stripped of everything else. He understood immediately that she did not mean the tactical justification or the strategic projection data or the political process that had led to the vote. She meant the real reason, the one underneath all of those things. He was quiet for a long time. The honest answer was not one he had said out loud to anyone, including himself. In a clear and undefended form, he had always dressed it in data and frameworks and the language of responsibility to the galactic order. "Fear," he said finally. "We were afraid." He looked at his hands on the table. 200 years of projection modeling across every methodology we had, all of it pointing toward the same outcome. A species like humanity, unconstrained, growing at the rate they were growing, becoming something the rest of the galaxy would have no meaningful ability to influence or check within 5 centuries. He paused. "We looked at those models and we saw the end of everything we had built. And we decided that the only way to prevent it was to act before it was too late to act." Voss listened to all of this without changing her expression. "That is what the data told us," Vale said, "and we believed the data." You ran the projections, Voss said. Yes. And you saw the outcome. Yes. She leaned forward slightly. We ran the same projections, she said. Our analysts working independently using our own models. We got the same numbers you got. Same timeline, same dominance curve, same conclusion about where humanity was heading. She held his eyes. We made a different decision. He stared at her. What decision? We decided to use it to lift everyone else up, she said. We looked at those numbers and we thought, if we are going to be the largest force in this part of the galaxy in 500 years, then the most important thing we can do right now is make sure that everyone else is strong enough, developed enough, and connected enough that our size does not become their problem. She sat back. You should have asked us what we were planning before you fired the first shot, Ambassador. The room was very quiet. Vale looked at her for a long time. He thought about 60 years of service to a council that had believed it was protecting the galaxy. He thought about the vote, and Sorvin's voice saying, I don't think they will panic, and the fires on Oros Prime that he had watched on a secure monitor with the cold certainty of a man who believed he had done what needed to be done. I did not ask, he said, and his voice was very quiet, because I did not consider that the answer might be something I wanted to hear. Voss nodded once slowly. I would like to show you something, she said. If you are willing to travel, I can arrange it with the tribunal, a supervised visit, full transparency, whatever conditions they require. What would you show me? He asked. Something we have been building, she said, for 15 years, quietly. The tribunal approved the visit in 4 days, which was extremely fast for a body that had been deliberating for 4 months. But the request had come from Admiral Voss personally, and the tribunal members were not, in the end, willing to be the people who told her no. They traveled together on a Terran transport, Voss and Vale and 2 Crethan security officers who were there to satisfy the tribunal's requirements, and spent most of the journey trying not to look like they were fascinated by the ship they were on. The journey took 3 days. Voss spent part of it working at a desk in the common area. She did not attempt to fill the time with conversation, which Vale found, unexpectedly, that he appreciated. On the 3rd day they came out of faster-than-light travel, and the thing was there in front of them. Vale stood at the observation port and looked at it for a very long time. It was vast in a way that was difficult to process. The construction extended across an area of space that took several minutes to fully take in, even from a distance. Enormous ring structures, hundreds of them, in varying stages of completion, connected by framework and supply lines and the moving lights of thousands of construction ships. Jump gates, he recognized the architecture, but on a scale nothing in the known galaxy had ever attempted. A relay network that would connect species across distances that currently took decades to cross, cutting travel times to fractions of what they were, making the outer reaches of explored space as accessible as neighboring systems. And it would benefit everyone. That was the part he kept returning to as he stood there looking at it. The design was not proprietary. It was not built to give humanity a travel advantage. The gate architecture was open source, already distributed to every species in the Terran Compact, fully replicable by anyone with sufficient engineering capacity. Humanity was building the network and then giving it away, because the goal was not to be faster than everyone else. The goal was to make everyone faster together. How long have you been building this? Vale asked. 15 years, Voss said from beside him. The Council's intelligence services, he said slowly. They knew about this. 3 of their agencies had reports on it, yes. He turned to look at her, and they did not flag it as a threat. They did not know what to do with it, she said. They kept waiting for the strategic purpose to become clear, the hidden angle, the reason we were doing it that would make sense in the framework they were using to analyze us. She looked at the construction ahead of them. They filed it as possible disinformation and moved on because the alternative, that we were building this for the reason it appeared to be built for, did not fit the model they had of us. Vale was quiet for a very long time. The construction ships moved in their slow, purposeful patterns ahead of them, each one doing its small part in something enormous, each one part of a project that had been planned and funded and worked on across 15 years by a species that had simultaneously been negotiating council membership, colonizing 30 worlds, and developing 3 new forms of faster-than-light travel. He thought about the projection models again, the 500-year dominance curve, the numbers that had looked like a threat. He thought about what it meant that those same numbers had looked, to the people they described, like a responsibility. "I was wrong," he said. "It came out plainly, without performance, the way simple true things sometimes do when you have been carrying them long enough that you are tired of the weight." Voss did not say anything. She let the words exist without adding to them. He looked at the network being built ahead of them, and then he made a decision. A small one in the physical sense, nothing more than a thought forming and being accepted. But it felt, from the inside, like the largest thing he had done in 60 years of service. "When we return," he said, "I would like to speak with Sorvin about the invitation." Weiss nodded, that was all. 6 weeks later, on an ordinary Tuesday, a document arrived at the Terran Compact's administrative office on Earth. It bore the official seal of the Crethan Dominion and the signature of a retired ambassador who was still technically awaiting a tribunal conclusion, but had been released to house arrangement pending that conclusion. It was the 17th and final application for membership in the Compact. An automated confirmation went back within seconds. It read, "Welcome, we're glad you're here." In a long archive building at the edge of the capital on Volkai Prime, a historian named Seth sat at her desk and looked at the document she was supposed to be finishing. It was the official record of what the Compact Archive had designated the Meridian War, a 4-month conflict that had reshaped the political structure of the known galaxy more completely than anything in the past 1,000 years. She had been working on it for 8 months. She was good at her work. The facts were all correct. The timeline was accurate. The strategic and political analysis was solid. But she had been sitting for 3 hours in front of the final summary line, and she could not finish it, because she could not find words that were accurate and also small enough to fit in a summary line. She thought about what had actually happened. 17 civilizations had looked at one species and decided they were too dangerous to be allowed to exist as they were. And that species had looked back at all 17 of them and made a decision that was, in terms of pure strategic logic, almost inexplicable, to answer overwhelming betrayal with a demonstration of what they were actually capable of, followed by an immediate and genuine offer to share it. She thought about the relay network, still being built at the edge of explored space. She thought about the Compact, 17 members and growing. She thought about Admiral Voss sitting across a small table from the man who had voted to destroy her people's home worlds, asking him one question, and then listening to the answer without judgment. She picked up her pen. She wrote, 17 civilizations looked at humanity and saw a threat. Humanity looked back and saw a family it had not met yet. The war lasted 4 months. The lesson lasted forever. She looked at it for a moment, then she closed the file. Outside the archive's long windows, the city was doing what cities do, moving, building, living, continuing, under a sky that was the same as it had always been. The stars were where they had always been, but the space between them was different now, threaded with new connections and new understanding, built by a species that had decided, when given the chance to become what everyone feared, to become something else instead. The file was closed, the record was complete, the galaxy kept turning. The Galactic Council had been watching Earth for a very long time. They had built towers on distant moons and placed silent satellites near the edge of the solar system. They watched through lenses and sensors. They recorded everything. They took notes. They argued about the notes, and after hundreds of years of watching, they came to one simple conclusion about the small blue planet and the creatures that lived on it. Humans were not a threat. They were loud, they were messy. They fought each other over thin lines drawn on maps. They burned forests. They poisoned rivers. They built weapons and used them on themselves. They went to war over religion, over land, over words spoken badly at the wrong time. They were, in the opinion of most council species, the most chaotic and self-destructive form of intelligent life ever recorded in the galaxy. And yet, they never actually destroyed themselves. That was the strange part. Every time it looked like they had finally gone too far, every time a war got big enough, every time a disease spread wide enough, every time the planet itself seemed to be pushing back, the humans held on. They adapted. They rebuilt. They had a word for it: resilience. The council translators had looked it up. It meant the ability to recover from bad things. For humans, it seemed to be less of a word and more of a lifestyle. Still, the council did not take them seriously. Not really. When Earth finally sent its first faster-than-light ship into deep space, the council chamber received the signal like one might receive news that a dog had learned to open a door. Mildly interesting, not important. The ship was called the Odyssey. It was built over 30 years in secret by a coalition of 12 nations. It carried 6 crew members, 2 years of food, a library of Earth's art and music, and a message of peace written in 43 languages. It crossed into council-monitored space, broadcasting that message on repeat. The council listened politely. Then they classified Earth as a Tier 0 primitive species, the lowest possible rank, and moved on to other business. But one being in that chamber did not move on so quickly. Councillor Vrock of the Dominari Empire sat in his high seat and looked at the star charts on the display in front of him. He was a tall creature, gray-skinned and cold-eyed, with a mind that was always calculating. He did not care much about what humans were. He cared about where they lived. Earth's solar system sat at the crossroads of 3 major hyperspace lanes. 3. That was almost unheard of. Those lanes connected dozens of star systems. Whoever controlled them controlled the fastest trade and travel routes in that entire region of the galaxy. For centuries, those lanes had been mostly unused because no civilized species had wanted to settle so close to the chaotic little planet with the violent little creatures on it. But now the violent little creatures had a faster-than-light ship. Vrock stood up in the chamber and made his proposal clearly and without apology. Earth should be subjugated before it grew any stronger. The humans should be removed from positions of power over their own planet, relocated to controlled zones, and the solar system should be brought under Dominari management. It was not cruelty, he said. It was strategy. It was the practical thing to do. The chamber debated for 2 days. In the end, the vote was 44 in favor and 3 against. The 3 who voted against were small and quiet delegations. The Kelthari were tall, thin beings who had studied Earth longer than most. The Osavane were a seafaring species who had, in their own ancient past, been subjugated by a stronger power and had never forgotten how it felt. And the Mu, no one knew much about the Mu. They rarely spoke. They had not built a warship in over 1,000 years, but they came to every meeting and they listened to everything. All 3 of them voted no. When asked to explain, the Kelthari ambassador rose from her seat and looked across the chamber with steady eyes. "You have not read enough of their history," she said. That was all she said. She sat back down. Councillor Vrock smiled at her. It was not a kind smile. "We have read all of their history," he said. "That is precisely why we are not afraid." The session ended. The decision was made. A fleet would be assembled. 200 warships from the Dominari Empire supported by additional vessels from 6 other council members. It would be the largest show of force ever directed at a pre-membership species. But Vrock did not expect it to be a fight. He expected it to be a formality, a demonstration. Humans would see the fleet, understand the situation, and surrender. That was how these things went. He had done it 4 times before with 4 other species. None of them had fought back for more than a week. Back on Earth, no one knew any of this yet. Life went on the way it always did. Cities hummed with noise and movement. Children went to school. Farmers worked their fields. Scientists stayed up late in their laboratories. Soldiers trained on dusty bases. Sailors crossed dark oceans. Old people sat on porches and watched the sun go down. The Odyssey had returned home 6 months earlier. Its crew had been celebrated, interviewed, studied. They had brought back data about deep space that would take decades to fully understand. They had brought back something else too, the unmistakable feeling that the galaxy was not empty and that something out there had noticed Earth. Certain people in certain governments had taken that feeling very seriously. In a mountain facility in northern Canada, a woman named General Yara Osai sat at a long table with 30 other people and looked at satellite data that had been classified at the highest level for 9 years. Yara was a calm woman. She had short gray hair and dark, careful eyes. She had spent her career thinking about problems that most people did not know existed. The data on the table showed movement, deep space movement, ships, organized, coordinated, and heading in one direction. Toward Earth. How long? She asked the analyst sitting to her left. At their current speed, the analyst said, approximately 4 months. Yara looked at the data for a long moment. Then she looked up at the room. Then we have 4 months, she said. Let's not waste them. She stood up, buttoned her jacket, and walked to the door. Before she left, she paused and looked back at the table full of people. Tell the construction teams to speed up, she said, and tell them to stop hiding the ships behind the moon one at a time. There's no point pretending anymore. We need all of them ready. Nobody asked how many ships there were. Everyone in that room already knew. The number was not something that was ever written down in any document that could be found easily. It was a number that had been built slowly and quietly over 3 decades of black budget programs, late-night assembly lines, and engineers who had signed papers agreeing never to speak about their work. It was a very large number. Outside the facility, the sky was dark and full of stars. Yara stood for a moment and looked up at them. She had looked up at that sky her whole life. She had always found it beautiful. She still did. But now, for the first time, she also found it useful. Something was coming. Something that thought the planet below her was easy. She almost smiled. They had no idea what was waiting for them. The Dominari fleet dropped out of hyperspace just past Jupiter, and for a moment, space itself seemed to go quiet. 200 warships appeared in a long, curved formation that stretched across thousands of kilometers. Each ship was dark gray and angular, built for intimidation as much as for war. Their hulls were thick with weapons and armor. Their engines burned a deep violet color that lit up the surrounding space like a slow, cold fire. It was the kind of sight that was designed to make something feel small. It was designed to make something feel afraid. From Earth, the fleet showed up on every sensor and radar system within seconds. Alarms went off in military bases on 6 continents. Phones rang in government buildings. People were pulled out of beds and meetings and meals and rushed into secure rooms underground. The news networks picked up the sensor data 17 minutes later, and within an hour, every person on the planet with a screen knew that something very large had just parked itself near Jupiter and was pointing in their direction. There was panic in some places. There always is. But in the places that mattered most, there was something different. There was a strange, focused stillness, like the stillness of a person who has spent years training for something and is now, finally, watching it arrive. Admiral Sekvaro stood on the bridge of his flagship, the Eternal Dominion, and looked at the image of Earth on his forward display. It was a small planet, blue and green and covered in clouds. It looked soft from this distance, almost gentle. He had been given very clear orders. He was to transmit the surrender demand, give the humans time to respond, and then, if they refused, he was to advance and begin the subjugation. It was expected to be simple. It was expected to be fast. Counselor Vrock had told him personally that he did not expect the operation to last more than 2 weeks from start to finish. Sekvaros had done this kind of work before. He was good at it. He was patient and precise, and he did not enjoy unnecessary violence. He preferred when species simply looked at his fleet and understood the situation without needing a demonstration. It saved time, it saved resources, and it kept his record clean. He nodded to his communications officer, who opened the channel. The broadcast went out across every frequency that human technology could receive. It was translated into 12 of Earth's most widely spoken languages by the fleet's translation systems. The message was long and detailed, 12 full minutes of transmission, and it covered every point carefully. It said that Earth had been assessed by the Galactic Council and found to be an unqualified species for independent governance of a strategically important region of space. It said that the Council, in its wisdom and authority, had voted to assume administrative control of the Sol system and its surrounding lanes. It said that all human military forces were to stand down immediately and surrender their weapons and vessels to Dominari custody. It said that the human population would be relocated over a period of years to 3 designated continental zones, where they would be provided for and kept safe under Council supervision. It said that resistance would be considered an act of aggression against the full authority of the Galactic Council and would be responded to with complete and overwhelming force. It ended by giving Earth exactly 72 hours to comply. On Earth, the message was received and translated and read and reread by hundreds of officials across dozens of governments. There were emergency sessions. There were arguments in many languages. There were people who were terrified and people who were furious and people who were both at the same time. In the underground command facility in northern Canada, General Yara Os sat at the head of a long table and listened to the full broadcast played back from start to finish without interruption. She did not move much while she listened. When it ended, the room was very quiet. She looked around the table slowly. She looked at the faces of the admirals and generals and defense ministers who had gathered there. Some of them were pale. Some of them were tight-jawed and hard-eyed. One of them was quietly doing the kind of breathing a person does when they are trying very hard not to show that their hands are shaking. Yara folded her hands on the table in front of her. "They gave us 72 hours, she said. "Yes," said the admiral to her right. "We don't need 72 hours, she said. She stood up, straightened her jacket, and walked to the communications panel on the far wall. She typed in the authentication codes herself. She did not ask anyone else to do it. She opened the channel manually, set it to broadcast on the same frequencies the Dominari fleet had used, and picked up the microphone. The message she sent back was 11 seconds long. She said, in a clear and level voice, that the people of Earth had received the Council's transmission. She said that Earth was a sovereign world and would remain so. She said that no human being would be relocated, no human weapon would be surrendered, and no human government would accept administration from any outside authority. She said that the Dominari fleet had 48 hours to reverse course and leave the solar system. And then she said, very calmly, that this was the only warning they would receive. She put the microphone down, walked back to her seat, and picked up her coffee. On the bridge of the Eternal Dominion, the 11-second reply came through the speakers and was translated in real time. Admiral Sekvaros listened to it once. Then he played it again. Then he looked at his senior officers, and for a moment, no one spoke. Then someone laughed. It started small, a short and disbelieving sound, and then it spread across the bridge until half the officers were laughing. Sekvaros himself allowed a thin smile to cross his face. He had received replies like this before, from species that did not fully understand their situation. It was a kind of bravery, he supposed, a pointless kind, but bravery nonetheless. He sent a brief message to Counselor Vrock. "The humans have declined. proceeding as planned after the deadline. Vrock's reply came back in under a minute. Expected. Do not draw it out. What neither of them saw, because their sensors were not looking in the right direction, was what was happening behind the moon. Earth's moon is large enough to hide things. It always had been. Over 30 years, piece by piece, ship by ship, the pieces of humanity's real fleet had been moved there. Not in plain sight, not announced. Quietly, carefully, in the slow and patient way that humans did things when they did not want to be noticed. There were 3,400 vessels behind that moon. They ranged from small and fast strike ships to large carrier vessels that held hundreds of the autonomous drone units that Earth's engineers had spent 15 years perfecting. They were not beautiful ships. They were not built to look impressive. They were built the way humans built most things when they were truly serious, to work, to last, to do what they were supposed to do and keep doing it. The crews on those ships had been waiting for weeks. Some of them had been waiting for years. They were not soldiers who had been drafted in a hurry. They were people who had trained for this specific moment, who had run simulations of this exact scenario hundreds of times, who had eaten and slept and exercised and argued and laughed and read books and written letters home, while sitting in ships parked behind the moon, waiting for the thing they had always known was eventually coming. When the 48-hour clock started, the ships began powering their systems up. Not all at once, quietly, in stages, so that the energy signatures built up slowly enough not to trip the Dominari fleet's long-range sensors too early. In the command facility, Yara finished her coffee, set the cup down, and opened a new screen on the desk in front of her. It showed 3,400 small green dots arranged in a neat formation on the dark side of the moon. She watched them for a moment. Then she began to write orders. The 48 hours ended at 400 on a Tuesday morning. Nobody on Earth was asleep. General Yara Osai sat in the command facility and watched the clock on the wall tick to 0. The room was full of people. Every screen was lit. Every console had someone sitting at it. The air was thick with the smell of coffee and the low sound of keyboards and the occasional short, clipped voice of someone reading out a number or a coordinate. It was the kind of controlled noise that happens when a very large number of very prepared people are all doing their jobs at the same time. Yara looked at the clock. She looked at the screen showing the 3,400 green dots still sitting behind the moon, fully powered, fully loaded, crews at their stations. She looked at the screen showing the Dominari fleet near Jupiter, sitting in the same curved formation it had been in for 2 days, unhurried, unbothered, still clearly expecting a second message from Earth that would begin the process of surrender. She picked up the command line and spoke 2 words. Begin engagement. Behind the moon, 3,400 ships moved at once. They came around the edge of the moon in 3 waves, fast and organized, spreading out as they cleared the lunar surface so that the formation expanded wide rather than bunching together. The first wave was made up of the strike ships, small, quick, difficult to lock onto. The second wave was the carrier vessels. The third wave was something the Dominari fleet had no category for at all, because nothing like it had ever been built before. On the bridge of the Eternal Dominion, the alarm started going off before anyone fully understood what they were looking at. Admiral Sekvaros stood up from his chair and stared at the tactical display. The number of contacts appearing on the screen was climbing so fast that the display software was struggling to keep up. His sensor officer was reading out numbers in a rising voice. 40 contacts, 80, 200, 400, sir. I'm reading over 1,000 contacts, and the count is still going up. That is not possible, Sekvaros said. 1,500, 2,000, sir. I'm reading over 3,000 individual contacts, confirmed weapons signatures on all of them. The bridge went silent for 1 long second. Then every alarm on the ship went off at once. The drone swarms hit first. They came out of the carrier vessels in clouds so dense that they looked like dark fog on the Dominari sensors. Each drone was small, no bigger than a ground vehicle, and by itself, it was not especially dangerous. But they did not operate by themselves. They operated in swarms of 10,000, coordinated by software that made decisions in fractions of a second, responding to each other and to the battlefield in real time. They had been designed specifically to overwhelm shield systems through sheer volume and speed. The lead Dominari ships opened fire immediately. Their weapons were powerful and accurate, and they destroyed drones by the hundreds. But for every 100 drones destroyed, 1,000 more filled the gap. The swarms did not slow down. They did not change their behavior because they were taking losses. They simply kept coming, kept pushing, kept pressing against the shields of the Dominari vessels with a patience that had no emotion behind it at all. Within 4 minutes, the first Dominari shields failed. Within 8 minutes, 6 ships had been stripped of their defensive systems and were taking direct hits from the strike ship wave that had closed the distance while the drones did their work. Sekvaros was shouting orders now. His fleet was experienced and disciplined, and they fought back hard. They destroyed drones by the tens of thousands. They hit several of the human strike ships and damaged them badly. 2 human vessels were destroyed in the first 20 minutes of the fight. His fleet was not helpless. He had been in wars before. He knew how to fight. But he did not know how to fight this. The thing that broke his understanding came in the second hour. The Dominari fleet had grouped 3 of its heaviest warships together in a defensive cluster, using their overlapping shields to protect each other while they focused fire on the incoming strike ships. It was a sound tactic. It was something that had worked in every engagement Sekvaros had ever been part of. He watched on the display as a group of 17 human ships broke off from the main formation and accelerated toward the cluster. They were accelerating harder than made sense for an attack run. Much harder. The speeds the sensors were reading were not attack speeds. They were ramming speeds. "They are not going to," his weapons officer began. They did. 14 of the 17 ships were unmanned. They had been built specifically for this. They had been loaded with dense metal cores and accelerated to a significant fraction of the speed of light. And when they hit the Dominari defensive cluster, the result was not an explosion in the way that word is usually understood. It was a collision of so much mass moving so fast that the physics of it were almost indescribable. 2 of the 3 heavy warships were destroyed completely. The third was knocked out of the formation and left spinning and dark. On the Dominari fleet's communication channels, the voices of the officers changed. The professional calm broke. In its place was something that Sekvaros had not heard in many years of command. Fear. But the physical battle was only part of what was happening to his fleet. Somewhere in the middle of the second hour, every Dominari communication channel was compromised. Not jammed, compromised. The channels still worked. They could still talk to each other, but running beneath their own communications, quiet at first and then growing louder and impossible to ignore, was something being broadcast directly into their systems. It was information. Specifically, it was the history of Earth. Not summaries, not highlights, the actual detailed, unedited record of 10,000 years of human civilization, wars that lasted decades, cities burned and rebuilt, plagues that killed half a continent and then were beaten back, empires that rose and fell and rose again in different shapes, species-level catastrophes that should have ended humanity and instead produced new technologies, new alliances, new ways of surviving. The records came with images and sounds, battles in mud and battles in space. Voices of leaders and ordinary people in the worst moments of their history, and then voices of those same people getting back up afterward. The Dominari soldiers listened in spite of themselves. They could not help it. It was everywhere on their systems, and it was impossible to ignore. And as the battle raged around them, the understanding began to settle in, a cold and deeply uncomfortable understanding about what kind of creature they had decided to subjugate. These were not people who had been pushed into a corner and were now desperately throwing everything they had. These were people who had been preparing for this, who had looked at the sky and known something was coming, and spent 30 years getting ready without ever once panicking, who had built thousands of ships in secret while presenting a face of helplessness to the galaxy, who fought in ways that broke tactical logic because they had looked at their own history and understood that the species that survived was not always the strongest. It was the one that refused, absolutely and completely, to stop. By hour 11, 67 Dominari warships had been destroyed. 40 more were crippled and drifting. The rest were in full retreat back toward the hyperspace entry point near Jupiter. Sekvaro stood on the bridge of the Eternal Dominion, which was still functional but badly damaged, and looked at what remained of his fleet on the display. He had entered this system with 200 warships and the quiet certainty of a man who had never truly lost a battle. He sent a message to Counselor Vrock. It was short. There was not much that needed to be said. "We are withdrawing. Do not send more ships. I will explain when I return." He paused before sending it and added one more line. "Read their history, all of it, start from the beginning." Then he closed the channel, sat down in his command chair, and did not speak again for a very long time. Behind the retreating fleet, Earth ships held their formation. They did not pursue. They did not need to. The strike ships circled back. The drone clouds condensed and returned to their carriers. The unmanned ramming vessels were gone, their job done. In the command facility, the room was very quiet. On the main screen, the Dominari fleet was shrinking toward Jupiter, growing smaller and faster as it ran for the hyperspace lane. General Yara Osai watched it go. She did not cheer. She did not smile. She sat with her hands flat on the table and watched until the last Dominari ship vanished from the sensor screen. Then she looked at her watch. 11 hours and 22 minutes. She nodded once, the way a person nods when a thing they planned for a long time goes more or less the way they expected. "Get me casualty reports," she said, "and someone make fresh coffee. We have a lot of work to do." The recording of the battle reached the Galactic Council chamber in less than 6 hours. It came in the form of a full sensor log pulled from 3 separate observation relays that had been watching the Sol system since the fleet departed. It was raw data, unedited, and it showed everything. The drone swarms, the ramming ships, the shield failures, the retreat, all of it from start to finish in precise and terrible detail. The council session that was called to review it was supposed to be attended by senior representatives only. Instead, every delegate who could get to the chamber in time showed up. Species that rarely attended emergency sessions sent their highest officials. The hall was fuller than it had been in decades. Every seat was taken. Beings stood along the walls. The air was thick with different atmospheres being processed through different breathing apparatuses, and the noise before the session began was unlike anything the hall staff could remember. Then the recording played. The room went completely silent. No one spoke for the full duration. No one shifted in their seat or whispered to a neighbor or checked their communications devices. They watched the display screens at the front of the chamber, and they did not look away. They watched 200 Dominari warships get taken apart by a species that the Council had classified as a Tier 0 primitive just 4 months earlier. They watched the drone clouds. They watched the ramming ships and felt the silence of the chamber get heavier when those vessels hit their targets. They watched the retreat. When the recording ended, the silence lasted a long time. It was the Kelthari ambassador who spoke first. She did not raise her voice. She did not say anything dramatic. She simply turned in her seat and looked across the chamber at the section where the Dominari delegation was sitting, and she looked at them for a moment without saying a word. Then she turned back to face the front of the room and said nothing further. She did not need to. What followed was not a debate so much as a slow and collective unraveling. The first thing the council did was attempt to reclassify Earth. A junior analyst had already submitted a revised assessment before the session began. The original Tier 0 classification had been crossed out and replaced with Tier 4 military power. By the time the document reached the floor of the chamber, someone had crossed that out too and written Tier 7. A delegate from the Vreth Collective raised their hand and asked, in a carefully controlled voice, whether the existing tier classification system even had a category that accurately described what they had just watched. No one had a good answer for that. The Vreth Collective was the first to act in a way that could be described as panic, though their representative would later insist the word was unfair. Within hours of the session, the collective quietly issued internal orders to withdraw all border patrol vessels from the two star systems closest to Earth's solar system. When asked about this in the chamber, their delegate said it was a routine redeployment. Nobody believed that. Nobody said so out loud either. The Shorek Mercantile Guild moved even faster. They had always been more interested in profit than in politics, and they had a talent for reading situations quickly. Before the session had even formally closed, they had already drafted a trade partnership proposal and sent it through back channels to every human diplomatic contact they had on file, which was 2 contacts, neither of whom had significant authority. The proposal offered favorable trade terms, shared shipping rights on 2 minor hyperspace lanes, and a standing invitation for human representatives to visit the Guild's central trading station. It was thorough. It was generous. It was the kind of offer that the Sharak had never made to any species that they did not believe was capable of doing them serious harm. Nobody at the council chamber missed the significance of that. Other delegations began having quiet conversations in the corridors outside the main hall. Small groups gathered near doorways and spoke in low voices about defense arrangements, about border agreements, about which species were geographically close to the Sol system and might want to consider the implications of that. Several delegations sent encrypted messages home recommending immediate military reviews. A few recommended more than that. Inside the chamber, the situation with Councillor Vrock deteriorated quickly. Vrock had not spoken since the recording ended. He sat in his high seat and looked at the display screen at the front of the room, which had gone back to showing the standard council information feed, and he said nothing while the chamber fell apart around him. He was a smart being. He had understood within the first 10 minutes of watching the battle recording exactly how badly he had misjudged the situation. He had understood it the way you understand something when you are watching it happen in front of you, and there is no version of events in which you are not responsible. But understanding it privately and surviving it publicly were 2 different things. The leaked communications came out before the second day of sessions was finished. Someone in the Dominari information system, no one ever found out who, released a full archive of the internal messages surrounding the decision to subjugate Earth. They showed every step of the planning. They showed the dismissal of the 3 warning votes. They showed the messages Vrock had exchanged with his senior military advisors in which Earth's military potential was discussed and consistently minimized. They showed the message he had sent to Admiral Sekvaros on the day of the fleet's departure, in which he had said, with complete confidence, that he expected the operation to be finished before most of the galaxy even heard about it. The archive was distributed across the galactic communication network and viewed by billions of beings before the end of the week. Vrock's political career did not decline after that. It ended. He resigned from his council seat on the 3rd day before anyone formally asked him to. He was replaced by a younger Dominari official who gave a careful speech about the Empire's commitment to reviewing its foreign engagement policies and said the word accountability several times. Nobody found the speech especially convincing, but it was the beginning of a process, and processes take time. In a quiet corner of the chamber on the afternoon of the 3rd day, the Mu delegation did something they had not done in living memory. They issued a public statement to the Galactic Communication Network. The statement was short. It was 4 sentences long. It said that the Mu had voted against the subjugation proposal. It said that the reason for that vote had been their long study of human history and human behavior. It said that the council had been warned. And it ended with 2 words that became, within days, the most widely repeated phrase in the galaxy. We tried. The statement was shared so many times on so many networks that it became a kind of cultural moment for dozens of species simultaneously. Artists made images of it. Comedians referenced it. Political commentators used it in essays about council overreach and the dangers of dismissing small voices in large rooms. The Mu, who had never sought attention, found themselves receiving more messages from other species than they had in the previous 100 years combined. Most of the messages were some version of admiration. A few were apologies. Meanwhile, an unremarkable human diplomatic vessel departed Earth on a heading toward the Council's central station. It was a single ship, small, unarmed, and broadcasting peaceful intent on every available frequency. It carried 3 ambassadors chosen by a coalition of Earth's governments. Their names were Dr. Amara Solis, a trade economist from Mexico City, Ambassador Curran Maida, a career diplomat who had spent 30 years negotiating territorial agreements between nations, and Dr. Jonas Brandt, a legal scholar who had written extensively on interplanetary law and who had spent the last 4 months reading every piece of Galactic Council legal documentation he could get his hands on. They also carried an artificial intelligence translation system, 6 months of supplies, and a very large quantity of coffee, which Maida had insisted on packing personally, and which he had explained to the other 2 was not optional. The message that Earth's government transmitted to the Council ahead of the ship's arrival was received in the chamber on the morning of the 4th day. It was read aloud by the session chair, and it produced a silence of a very different quality than the silence after the battle recording. It said that Earth had no interest in revenge. It said that humanity understood the value of stable relationships and long-term cooperation. It said that the 3 hyperspace lanes running through the Sol system were an asset that could benefit many species if managed with fairness and proper agreement. It said that Earth's ambassadors were on their way and would arrive in approximately 3 weeks. And then, at the end, in language that was polite and reasonable, and somehow still managed to feel like a door being held open by someone very strong, it said that Earth looked forward to discussing terms. The session chair set down the message and looked at the chamber. In the front row, the Kelthari ambassador allowed herself a very small smile. 3 weeks was not a long time, but for a council that had spent 4 days trying to put itself back together, it felt like it was going to be a very busy 3 weeks indeed. The human diplomatic ship docked at the Council's central station on a quiet morning, and the station had never been so full of beings pretending not to stare. The central station was the largest structure ever built by the combined species of the Galactic Council. It was a city in space, really a vast, spinning ring of metal and glass and pressurized corridors that housed thousands of permanent residents and could receive delegations from 47 species at the same time. It had seen wars end and alliances form and treaties signed that changed the shape of the galaxy. It had seen many things in its long history. It had never seen anything quite like the arrival of 3 humans carrying travel bags and a crate of coffee. The docking bay where the ship came in was supposed to have only essential staff present. Instead, it had somewhere between 200 and 300 beings crowded along the upper observation rails, watching through the transparent walls as the small human vessel settled into its berth and the airlock connected. They were there out of curiosity mostly. Some were there out of nervousness. A few were there because they had watched the battle recording so many times that the humans had become something larger than life in their minds, and they needed to see with their own eyes that they were, in fact, just people. The airlock opened, and Dr. Amara Solis stepped out first. She was a medium-sized woman with dark hair pulled back neatly, wearing a formal diplomatic jacket in deep blue. She looked around the docking bay with calm, interested eyes, the way a person looks when they have arrived somewhere new and are simply taking it in. She was followed by Ambassador Curran Maida, who was taller, older, and who walked with the unhurried ease of someone who had been in difficult rooms for most of his adult life. Behind him came Dr. Jonas Brandt, carrying a data tablet already open, his eyes moving across it even as he walked, which caused him to nearly step on Maida's heel before looking up and apologizing quietly. The council's receiving official, a small and formally dressed being named Coordinator Is, stepped forward and gave the traditional greeting of the council, a short bow with both hands open and visible. All three humans returned the bow without hesitation, which they had clearly practiced, and Is felt something it would later describe to a colleague as a complicated kind of relief. The negotiations began 2 days later. They took place in a medium-sized conference room on the station's diplomatic level. The room had been carefully prepared, atmosphere adjusted, temperature set to a range comfortable for humans, seating arranged to reflect equal standing rather than hierarchy. The council's lead negotiating team was made up of 5 senior delegates representing the largest member species. They arrived with full staffs and legal teams and documentation prepared in advance. They had spent 2 weeks getting ready for this. Dr. Brandt arrived with his data tablet and a second tablet as backup and a handwritten notebook that he set on the table next to the tablets and referred to constantly. Ambassador Maida arrived with a thermos of coffee and 2 cups, one of which he offered to the council's lead delegate, who accepted it cautiously, and then, after a careful sip, accepted a second cup 40 minutes later. Dr. Solis arrived with the numbers. She had spent 4 months doing nothing but studying the economic data of the 3 hyperspace lanes, their traffic volumes, their value to current users, the projected growth if access were expanded, the cost structures of different management models, and the specific ways in which fair revenue sharing could work across multiple species simultaneously. She had run the models hundreds of times. She knew the numbers better than anyone in that room, better probably than anyone in the station, and within the first hour of the negotiations, it became clear to the council's team that the quiet woman with the neat hair was the most prepared person at the table by a considerable distance. The negotiations lasted 6 weeks. They were not easy. There were long days and late nights and several moments when the discussion stalled and everyone went back to their quarters and did not speak to each other for 24 hours. There were points of genuine disagreement about jurisdiction and enforcement, and revenue percentages that required compromise from both sides. There were moments when Brandt's legal knowledge of council protocols was the only thing that broke a deadlock, because he would open his data tablet and cite a specific clause in a specific council document, and the other side's legal team would check it and find that he was exactly right every time. But the negotiations did not fall apart. They moved forward, slowly and then faster, because both sides had something real to gain, and because the 3 humans at the table were, without any drama or performance, simply very good at this. In the end, Earth walked away with everything that mattered. Full membership in the Galactic Council was granted without conditions. The vote was 41 in favor, 3 abstentions, and 3 votes of enthusiastic support from the Kalthari, the Asavane, and the Mu, whose representatives had attended every session of the negotiations as observers and said very little but watched everything. Earth was given a permanent seat in the primary chamber, not an observer seat, not a provisional seat, but a full voting seat with equal standing to species that had been members for thousands of years. Joint stewardship of the 3 hyperspace lanes was established under a new framework that Solis had largely written herself. Earth would manage day-to-day operations and receive 40% of the toll revenue. The remaining 60% would be distributed among the council members whose shipping traffic used the lanes most heavily. It was a structure that gave Earth genuine economic power without cutting anyone else out entirely, which was precisely why it passed with more support than anyone had expected. The formal apology from the Dominari Empire was the part that took longest to arrange, because it had never been done before in council history, and nobody was entirely sure what the correct procedure was. Brandt found a precedent in a 700-year-old council document that had never been used. He flagged it, cited it, and submitted a formal legal motion based on it before anyone on the other side had finished reading it. The apology was issued in writing, read aloud in open session, and entered permanently into the council's official record. It cited 34 specific violations of per-contact engagement protocols, each one documented and verified. Vrock was not present for any of it. He was home. On the last day of the negotiations, after the final documents were signed and the formal session closed, Ambassador Maida stayed behind in the conference room while the others went to the reception that had been arranged. He poured the last of the coffee from his thermos into his cup and sat at the empty table and looked at the walls for a while. Coordinator Is came in to check that the room was ready for the cleaning staff and found him there. It hesitated at the door. "You can come in," Maida said. Is stepped inside carefully. "Is something wrong, Ambassador?" Maida thought about that. "No," he said, "I was just thinking." "About what?" "About the fact that none of this had to happen," he said. "We could have been here from the beginning. We could have been members for years. We could have been partners." He looked at his cup. "They just had to ask." Is had no answer for that. After a moment it said, carefully, "I think many members of the council understand that now." Maida nodded. He finished his coffee, stood up, and picked up his jacket. Back on Earth, the celebrations were loud and long and genuine. Cities lit up at night. People gathered in squares and parks and watched the announcement broadcast on every screen. There were fireworks in some places, because humans had always used fire to mark the important moments, and this was one of the most important moments in their history. In the mountain facility in northern Canada, General Yara Osai did not watch the celebrations. She sat alone in her office with a star map on the screen in front of her. It showed the full shape of the known galaxy, the Council's territory at the center, charted and mapped and measured, and then beyond it, spreading outward in every direction, the parts that were not charted, the dark regions, the places where the Council's sensors did not reach and where no diplomatic vessel had ever returned from. The battle recordings had traveled far. Data moved fast in this galaxy. She knew that. She had always known it. Whatever was in those dark regions had seen what Earth could do. Maybe they were indifferent. Maybe they were cautious. Maybe they were drawing conclusions the same way the Council had drawn conclusions, and maybe some of them were drawing the same wrong ones. Or maybe something out there was not afraid of what it had seen. Maybe something out there found it interesting. Yara looked at the dark parts of the map for a long time. Then she opened a new file on her desk, labeled it with a date 6 months in the future, and began to write. Humanity had won one fight. The galaxy was old and large and full of things that had not yet introduced themselves. She intended to be ready.